All right, folks, buckle up because today we're diving headfirst into some really murky waters.
Oh, absolutely. Murky is a good word for it.
We're talking Ukrainian politics and trying to get a grip on public opinion over there.
Not an easy task.
Not at all. And it's a lot more complicated than you might think just from reading some headlines.
Absolutely. And particularly now, almost 3 years into the conflict.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone wants peace.
Of course.
But how to actually get there.
Right.
It's tough. A lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, it is. And that's actually why this interview with the Ukrainian journalist, Diana Panchenko, really caught our eye.
Interesting.
Yeah, she's offering a perspective that, honestly, you don't hear that often, especially when you start talking about President Zelensky's popularity and what the Ukrainian people are really feeling.
Yeah, her take is definitely different.
Is.
And I think her being a Ukrainian journalist but living in exile,
right.
You know, it adds another layer to think about.
Yeah, for sure. So let's unpack some of this. One of the things Panchenko said that really jumped out at us was about Zelensky's approval rating.
Oh, okay.
And she puts it super low, like shockingly low at 5%.
Wow.
And she argues that it's because most Ukrainians are just really disillusioned with his leadership, which, you know, kind of flies in the face of what we see a lot in Western media.
Yeah.
This whole image of like Ukrainians being totally united behind Zelensky and ready to resist no matter what.
It's definitely a different picture.
It is. Yeah.
It makes you think. Why would Panchenko, who's Ukrainian herself,
right?
Why would she paint things so differently? Is she hearing stuff that just isn't getting reported? Or could being in exile, you know, be coloring her perspective? What do you think?
It's a really good question. And Panchenko takes it a step further, too.
Okay.
She says this disillusionment, it comes from people just being exhausted by the war.
Yeah.
And wanting peace, even if it means accepting Russia's terms. She claims that's what she's hearing directly from Ukrainians.
That's a big deal if it's true. I mean, the narrative we mostly hear is about Ukrainians being united against Russia.
Exactly.
But if Panchenko's right, it means there's this whole other level of war fatigue, this desire for resolution.
Right.
That maybe isn't getting enough attention.
And all of that ties into her bigger point about Ukraine not really having much control on the world stage.
Okay.
She uses this really powerful analogy.
Oh, yeah.
She says the government's like, get this, a monkey with a grenade.
A monkey with a grenade.
Yeah. Capable of causing damage, but ultimately someone else is pulling the strings.
Wow, that's a striking image.
It is.
Really drives home her point about Ukraine being a ponton in this bigger geopolitical game.
And that decisions aren't really being made in Kyiv.
Right.
But in Washington and Moscow.
It makes you wonder who's really calling the shots.
Right. And she points a finger specifically at the U.S. She even mentions the Trump administration as having a ton of influence over Ukrainian politics. And get this, she claims Zelensky can only stay in power as long as the war keeps going.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Which brings up some pretty unsettling questions about why the West keeps sending support.
Yeah, if Panchenko's right, it means this conflict is about way more than just Ukraine's independence or Russian aggression.
Right.
It's like a proxy war.
Yeah.
Driven by the interests of these global superpowers.
Right.
And Ukraine is caught in the middle.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, too, what a peace deal on Russia's terms would actually mean for regular Ukrainians.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of Western aid.
Oh, right.
Panchenko doesn't hold back on this.
Okay.
She says there's rampant corruption in Zelensky's government and that a big chunk of the aid that's been sent over has been, well, misused.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. And she doesn't just say vague stuff. She mentions, quote, containers of cash being shipped out of Odessa.
Containers of cash.
Yeah.
That's hard to ignore.
It is. Makes you think she might have some inside information.
Right.
What do you make of all this? Do those allegations seem believable to you?
It's definitely a lot to process.
Yeah.
But before we get too lost in all the political maneuvering, it's important to remember the human cost of this conflict. And Panchenko really shines a light on that, especially when she talks about the impact on women.
Okay.
She uses the term women's rebellion to describe how they're trying to protect their husbands and sons from being mobilized. It's really about their strength and resilience in the face of all this pressure.
Yeah.
She talks about women literally confronting military recruiters.
Wow.
Desperate to keep their loved ones from the horrors of war.
Yeah. It's a powerful reminder that behind all the politics and military strategies,
right,
there are real people whose lives are being torn apart.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot. Zelensky's supposed unpopularity, Ukraine's lack of real power, corruption, the impact on women.
Yeah.
Panchenko definitely paints a pretty bleak picture, both of the current situation and Ukraine's future.
But she doesn't stop there. She actually compares Ukraine to Belarus.
To Belarus.
Yeah. And she praises its stability and independence.
Interesting. That's definitely not the usual take on Belarus.
It's not.
Usually it's portrayed as this authoritarian state controlled by Russia.
Right. But Panchenko seems to be hinting at a different model for success in the region.
Okay.
And this all feeds into her overall message, which is the urgent need for peace. She believes that despite everything, the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian people will find their way back to each other. She even says that if Zelenskyy loses power, his government might try to set up a government in exile.
Wow.
Which could drag the conflict out even longer.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought.
It is. It's a reminder that the path to peace is going to be really, really difficult.
No easy answers here.
No. It's a lot to take in, but it's a conversation we need to have. Panchenko's interview, it forces us to look at some hard truths about power, about who has agency, and about the human cost of all this.
Absolutely. It challenges us to think critically about the stories we're being told.
Yeah.
And to consider viewpoints that maybe we wouldn't normally.
Exactly.
Welcome back. Panchenko's insights into the whole Ukrainian conflict and how much people there want peace, it definitely gives us a lot to think about.
Absolutely. And as we dig deeper into her interview, she actually sheds more light on what peace could look like, both for Ukraine itself and its relationships with its neighbors.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because on the one hand, she paints this pretty bleak picture of where things stand now.
Right.
But on the other hand, she does seem to think resolution is possible.
Yeah.
If certain things happen.
Okay. So what would those things be?
Well, she really emphasizes that ending the fighting has to be the first step.
Makes sense.
Not just for practical reasons, but symbolic ones too.
Okay.
It's about moving away from this whole us versus them mindset that's caused so much division and violence.
Yeah, I can see that.
And once the fighting stops, it opens up the possibility for dialogue and understanding, which Panchenko thinks is absolutely essential for any kind of meaningful progress towards peace.
But she also acknowledges that it's not going to be easy.
Oh, absolutely not. Decades of propaganda and mistrust,
Yeah.
huge obstacles to overcome.
For sure. So let's say the fighting does stop. What kind of future does Panchenko see for Ukraine?
Well, she thinks the key to turning things around is giving Ukrainians a sense of hope.
Hope.
A real, tangible vision for something better.
Got it.
And she sees that hope rooted in a few key areas.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Well, first off, she says you have to confront and dismantle the narratives that have fueled the conflict.
Okay.
For example, she pushes back on this idea of Russia committing genocide against Ukrainians.
Okay.
She points out that there are millions of Ukrainians living peacefully in Russia.
So she's saying we need to move beyond this simplistic good versus evil narrative.
Exactly.
I mean, that's got to be hard for some people to accept, especially those who've experienced the violence firsthand.
It's definitely a challenging perspective. And to be honest, she's gotten a lot of criticism for it.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Some people accuse her of downplaying Russian aggression, even being a Russian apologist.
Right.
But I think it's important to remember that Panchenko isn't denying the suffering that's occurred.
Right.
She's just urging us to see the complexity of the situation, to look beyond those black and white labels.
So it's not about ignoring the atrocities or letting anyone off the hook.
No.
It's about understanding the nuances.
Yeah.
And realizing that peace might require us to see beyond this idea of enemies and allies.
Exactly. And, this is where Panchenko's own experience as a journalist becomes really relevant.
Oh, yeah.
She's faced immense pressure, even threats, for expressing her views.
Wow.
So she's not speaking from some detached, privileged position.
Right.
She's lived through this conflict, experienced the complexities firsthand,
Yeah.
and paid the price for challenging the mainstream narrative.
And now she's urging others to do the same.
Exactly. To think critically, to resist dehumanizing the other side, and to keep the dialogue going, even when it's hard.
That's powerful. And it sounds like it's resonating with some people.
It is.
She mentioned getting messages from Ukrainians who agree with her, call for dialogue and understanding.
Yeah, that's encouraging.
It is. It suggests that maybe beneath all the official pronouncements, there's this yearning for peace that's more widespread than we realize.
I hope so.
So that's the yearning. But how do we go from that to actual action? How do you rebuild relationships that have been so badly damaged?
Especially between Ukraine and Belarus and Russia.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the million-dollar question. And Panchenko actually believes, even with all the damage that's been done, there's still a foundation to build on.
And where does she see that foundation?
Shared history, shared culture, shared faith.
Right.
She points to these deep connections between the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian people.
So even though these countries have been torn apart by politics and conflict, there are still these threads of commonality.
Exactly. And Panchenko believes those threads are ultimately stronger than the forces trying to pull them apart.
But she's also realistic about the challenges.
Oh, absolutely. She acknowledges that all the propaganda, all the mistrust,
Yeah.
it's created huge obstacles to reconciliation.
Right.
And she emphasizes that everyone has a role to play in overcoming those obstacles.
Okay.
She urges people to choose understanding over hatred, to actively challenge the narratives that keep us divided.
It's like she's calling for a grassroots peace movement.
Yeah.
People coming together to build bridges instead of burning them down.
That's a great way to put it. She believes real change starts with individual choices, with each of us being willing to see beyond those labels of enemy and ally.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, how realistic is all of this, given what's happening on the ground right now?
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about deeply entrenched political divisions, allegations of war crimes, violence that just doesn't seem to be ending.
You're right. Those are real and serious concerns.
Yeah.
And Panchenko isn't naive about any of it.
Okay.
She knows that the road to reconciliation is going to be long and tough,
Yeah.
full of setbacks and disappointments.
But even so, she seems optimistic.
She does.
Like, she genuinely believes peace is possible
Yeah.
if we're willing to work for it.
And that's what makes her perspective so compelling, even if we don't agree with everything she says.
Right.
It challenges us to think differently,
Yeah.
to consider possibilities that might seem out of reach right now,
Yeah.
and to hold on to hope, even in the midst of all the darkness.
It's a good reminder that peace building isn't just the job of politicians and diplomats.
Right.
It starts with individuals,
Yeah.
with each of us choosing to engage with the world in a more thoughtful, more compassionate way.
I think that's a great takeaway.
And Panchenko's interview gives us a really valuable framework for doing that.
Yeah.
It encourages us to question assumptions,
Huh.
to challenge the narratives we're being given,
Right.
and to really seek out understanding, even when it's hard.
It's definitely food for thought.
It is. And in the last part of our deep dive, we're going to explore another really interesting part of Panchenko's analysis: the role of religion in all of this. Welcome back, everyone. We've been spending some time with Diana Panchenko's interview, and she's really given us a unique look at the conflict in Ukraine. We talked about Zelenskyy, the desire for peace, the chances for reconciliation.
Yeah. Lot to unpack.
It is.
Yeah.
And in this final part, we're going to dig into something that doesn't always get a lot of attention in the mainstream coverage:
Okay. What's that?
the role of religion in this whole mess.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And this is where things get even more fascinating. Panchenko seems to think that faith, especially the fact that they share Orthodox Christianity, could actually be a powerful force for bringing Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia back together.
That's a really interesting idea.
It is. But she also points out that there have been these deliberate attempts to suppress the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And she sees that as part of a bigger strategy to weaken the ties between these countries.
That's a pretty bold claim. What makes her think that?
Well, she points to the influence of the U.S., and specifically certain individuals who she believes have been working to undermine the Orthodox Church in Ukraine for decades.
So she's saying there's a hidden agenda here, something more than just promoting democracy and freedom in Ukraine.
Exactly. Panchenko believes these actions are ultimately about converting Ukrainians to Catholicism,
Wow.
which would essentially cut them off from their spiritual and cultural connection to Russia.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is, and she backs it up by highlighting the fact that Zelensky's government downplayed the importance of Orthodox Christmas.
Okay.
They even removed it as a public holiday, which Panchenko sees as a deliberate attempt to erase a core element of Ukrainian identity.
It's amazing how even something like a holiday can become such a big deal in a conflict like this.
Yeah, it is. And it shows how intertwined religion, culture, and politics are in that part of the world. But Panchenko also points out that even with all of that, a lot of Ukrainians still celebrate Orthodox Christmas,
Yeah, that makes sense.
even gathering in secret to hold services.
Wow.
It really shows the resilience of faith
It does.
and how deep those traditions run, even when there's pressure to abandon them.
Yeah, it suggests that people are holding on to their beliefs,
Right.
maintaining those cultural connections no matter what.
And Panchenko finds that hopeful.
I can see why.
It reinforces her belief that those shared spiritual bonds will eventually win out.
Okay, that's interesting. But what about Zelenskyy? What does she think he's ultimately trying to do?
Well, she's not very complimentary about his leadership, to put it mildly. She believes he's become isolated and unpopular. She even suggests his approval rating could be as low as 5%.
5%? Wow, that's incredibly low.
It is. And if it's true, it means there's a huge gap between Zelenskyy and the people he's supposed to represent.
Yeah, for sure.
Panchenko thinks he's only clinging to power because of the war. And she even suggests he might try to set up a government in exile if he loses power, which could drag the conflict out even longer.
That's a scary thought, especially since, as we've been talking about, so many Ukrainians just want peace.
It is. And there are signs that even those close to Zelenskyy are starting to doubt him. Panchenko mentions that his own party is thinking about rebranding, maybe moving away from the whole servant of the people image that got him elected in the first place.
So maybe the cracks are starting to show.
Panchenko thinks Zelenskyy's fall is inevitable.
Really?
She predicts that the U.S., with the new administration, will eventually get tired of him and push for his removal.
Yeah, okay.
And she points to the growing scrutiny of the corruption in his government as a potential trigger for that.
Interesting. So after this deep dive into Panchenko's perspective, what are your main takeaways? I mean, it's been a lot of controversial claims, some bold predictions.
It has. It's been eye-opening, that's for sure.
Yeah. She's definitely not afraid to challenge the usual narratives about what's going on in Ukraine.
Absolutely not. And that's exactly why her interview is so valuable. It forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths.
Right.
To consider different explanations for what's happening.
And it reminds us that in times of conflict, the truth can be really hard to find.
Yeah.
And that understanding requires us to engage with a variety of viewpoints.
Right. Even the ones that challenge our assumptions.
Exactly.
Well, it's been quite a journey. Panchenko's interview is a call to look beyond the headlines, to question everything we're being told, and to really search for a deeper understanding of this incredibly complex and tragic conflict.
I think that's a great way to put it.
And that's what we're all about here on The Deep Dive, encouraging you to think critically, to have informed discussions, and to navigate the complexities of the world around us.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving.